Chapter 3, Jon Conway. Seattle, Washington, Tuesday, September 5th, 7:20 p.m. Jon Conway stared out the window, counting the minutes before the 747 descended into SeaTac. Butterflies flittered through his stomach, just like they always did when he had to deal with his family in person. Although he was lost in thought, he felt someone staring at him. He turned to his left and saw the teenage goth girl, across the aisle in the window seat, was no longer hiding the fact that she'd recognized him despite the shades, black baseball cap, and bulky black coat he'd tried to hide in. "Are you Jon Conway?" she asked. The man beside her, likely her father, muttered an embarrassed, "I'm sorry." "It's okay," Jon said. "And yeah, it's me." "Oh my God, I told you, Dad. I'm such a fan. I love all your movies, even the ones the critics shit all over." The man shook his head. "Amber." "Sorry, Dad," she said to her father. "Can I get a picture?" Jon tried not to let his annoyance show. He hadn't done a movie in 4 years, but that only seemed to intensify fan reactions when he ran into them in public. He was especially popular with young girls, and even their moms, for his portrayal of the moody vampire in the Darkness Everlasting series, the flicks that launched him from critical darling to box office juggernaut, even though he found the 2 sequels creatively bankrupt. "Sure." He posed with the girl as her dad fumbled with her iPhone to snap a pic. He put his arm around her, resting it on her shoulder, and she melted into a series of giggles which belied her "I don't give a fuck" look of disaffected teen. After her dad snapped a couple of pics, the girl reached up and hugged Jon, as he awkwardly exchanged glances with the girl's dad. Jon imagined the dad was thinking one of 2 things: talentless douchebag or get your hands off my daughter, you pervert. Probably both, and particularly the latter, given Jon's reputation as someone who slept with half of Hollywood's A-list. After the girl thanked Jon and headed back to her seat, her dad surprised him. "Can I get a picture too?" Jon was caught off guard, enough to accidentally laugh. "I loved your work in This Ends Now," the man said. The indie film, This Ends Now, was a scathing satire of the consumerist culture Jon had written, directed, and starred in. While some critics loved it, others dismissed it as another pampered star, from a billionaire family no less, whining and biting the hand that feeds him. The movie also tanked at the box office, causing some to wonder if Jon's days as an A-lister were over. He'd been so disgusted by the bullshit following the movie that he'd turned down every script since. "I loved that movie too," the girl said as she took their photo. And then after a long pause, she added, "Are you going to do another Darkness Everlasting?" The author of the series had originally planned the series as a trilogy, but apparently she'd been unable to turn down a huge advance to bring the characters back for another book. Jon hadn't read the 4th book, but had heard it was little more than a blatant money grab, and he had no interest in making another shit film. "I don't know. Maybe with the right script and director. You never know." A bell dinged, and one of the flight attendants made the announcement asking everyone to take their seats and return their trays and seats to their upright positions. "Thank you." The girl's dad reached out to shake Jon's hand. "You're welcome." The girl thanked him as well. "Take care." Then Jon returned to his seat. Jon strapped in and tried to avoid looking back over in their direction and getting trapped in a conversation, or worse, having a conversation extend beyond the airplane. He'd have to pretend he got a call or something to break away and hope he didn't look like a giant prick. Even after all these years, meeting fans still made him apprehensive, so he tried to avoid it whenever possible. As the plane landed, Jon thought again about his family, and felt that old, familiar dread creeping through him. Jon had returned to Hamilton Island as few times as possible in the decade since he left the island for good at 21, the year he was finally certain he wanted little to do with his father, Blake Conway, and nothing to do with Conway Industries, the biotech company that had nudged their bloodline into the top 1% and built Hamilton Island into one of Puget Sound's most ideal getaways and homes. Conway Industries not only had its headquarters and several research laboratories on the island, it also owned and operated a small hospital that employed many and contributed reduced or free health care to the service industry workers who lived in the island's subsidized housing. On Hamilton Island, the Conways were revered by residents and politicians alike for their generosity. In reality, however, the Conway kingdom was built on hubris and treachery, which Jon wanted nothing to do with. He had squirmed free from nearly every obligation that would have pulled him back to Hamilton Island. But Sarah was dead, an accidental victim in a school shooting, and he never would have forgiven himself if he didn't go to her funeral. She was, after all, the one who got away. Well, he got away. She stayed put. But now that she was gone, it felt as if some future he imagined someday having with her was now dead too. The plane landed. Jon drove a rented Toyota Avalon to the ferry, then watched the island grow larger against the darkening sky as the ferry inched him closer to the countless memories he'd love to forget. 45 minutes later, he parked his car at the Sands of Time Hotel. Jon walked directly to the counter, dropped his bag at his feet, then glanced at the name on the hotel clerk's badge. "Hi there, Lydia. I believe my assistant reserved the top floor for me?" Under the name Jon Kafka. Lydia looked him up and down as she tried and failed to keep her jaw from dropping lower. She stuttered before finding her voice, then looked Jon in the eye. "Of course, Mr. Conway. Mr. Kafka." Jon smiled, then shook his head and softly said, "Thank you." Lydia smiled, typing on her keyboard. "How many keys will you be needing, Mr. Conway?" Then after a moment added, "There are 10 rooms total. Can I get 2 cards, all keyed to all the rooms?" "Sure." She smiled, then giggled and twirled a finger through her long, dark hair. "At least I think so. I've never done this before." After a few minutes, she handed Jon 2 cards and smiled. She was cute, likely in her mid-20s, too cute to be working behind the desk of a hotel on Hamilton Island. But he kept such thoughts to himself. This wasn't a pleasure trip, and while a night with Lydia could be fun and relaxing, the days after would be problematic and not worth the trouble. After another minute spent finding out if there were any new restaurants on the island, Jon was waiting for the elevator to ding, then open to his private floor. He was exhausted, but wasn't sure if he should get to bed early and wait to see everyone at the memorial in the morning, or catch up with Sarah's twin sister, Cassidy, first. Last he'd heard, Cassidy was still working at the Shipwreck, an appropriately named bar in the south end of the island. Of course, the last time he'd run into Cassidy, she'd been rude, probably holding a grudge for how things went bad between him and Sarah. The elevator dinged, and Jon decided that he was too exhausted to subject himself to Cassidy's anger, which would likely even be worse following the death of her sister. Though the twins fought as often as he did with his own family, Cassidy and Sarah actually had something the Conways didn't: love that bonded them together despite their differences. Jon crossed the hall, slipped his keycard into the door, dropped his bag by the door, then collapsed onto the king-sized bed, fully clothed. He was sound asleep 2 minutes later. Wednesday, the September 6th, afternoon. Jon sat 2 rows from the rear pew in the back of Great Endeavor Church, a non-denominational church that was also the island's biggest. It had that classic New England church architecture he admired, though he'd never been particularly religious. This had also been his church, though only from age 8 to 12 or so, during the time his parents enrolled him in Sunday school. Of course, they rarely went to church themselves. Their driver usually dropped him off. He flashed back decades to the many Sundays he sat next to Sarah, and sometimes Cassidy, trying not to giggle as Pastor Avery preached. They'd never been able to go a whole service without getting a stern look from the pastor. Jon's trip down memory lane was cut short when he realized Pastor Avery was looking at him as he addressed the congregation. Jon wondered what the old man must have thought of him, the godless heathen given to a life of excess and sin, come home to reap what he's sown. But the pastor wasn't that kind of man. He was serious, but kind, not someone who'd remind you of your sins when tragedy struck. The only voice in that guilty choir was Jon's conscience. This was the fourth service today, with the church holding a private friends and family service for each of the 6 victims of the school shooting. Later in the evening, the church was holding a mass joint service for the public. There were 24 people in the church besides himself and Cassidy, their mom and Sarah's daughter. Jon sat in the back, wearing dark shades and a black hat, which he'd used to avoid the press outside. The last thing he wanted was to have the press spinning this story and putting him into it, detracting from the tragedy and the memories of the victims. The memory of Sarah. His agent, Marty, had already informed him they were getting calls seeking his comment on the tragedy, simply because he'd lived there for so many years. The press had spotted him on the island already, so it was only a matter of time before the circus began. Marty suggested using Paladin security to keep people away from him. You might want to consider it, especially once they find out you and Sarah have a history. Jon hoped to be off the island before those dots were connected. His family owned Paladin, and he hated asking them for anything. He turned his attention back to the service. Every word from Pastor Avery's mouth was a cold blade in Jon's stomach. Sarah Hughes was funny and warm. The pastor's hands were in the air, and though his gaze traveled over each person in the room, Jon felt as if they lingered particularly longer on him. She was easy to talk to, a great listener, and so incredibly easy to like. Sarah loved teaching, cooking for her friends, talking on the phone, and growing her roses. He smiled, as though remembering their scent. The Abraham Lincoln was her favorite. Sarah loved foot rubs, the beach, and swimming, and she loved great food, especially Italian, the good stuff from the north, along with midnight snacks. He patted his tummy. Mostly ice cream. Pastor Avery found Jon's eyes and held them. Jon was certain he wasn't imagining it. Sarah loved staring at the stars, pondering our place in God's universe, and believing the impossible kept itself just one good idea away. She loved the laughter of children, especially her daughter, Emma, and every kid at Hamilton Island K-12. He raised his hands in the air again but locked his eyes on Jon. Sarah Hughes loved everyone in this room. The pastor held the moment, then lowered his arms and surrendered his gaze. Jon felt his own tears welling as the pastor began to pace the pulpit. Sarah would never have called herself an intellectual, but I would have disagreed. She was whip-smart, understood things in seconds when they should have taken minutes, and minutes if hours. She may not have known everything, but she knew all there was to know about being a good person, a great mom, and about leading a wonderful life. Sarah Hughes is gone before her time and will be forever missed. Tears painted the sides of the faces of Sarah's family at the front of the church. Pastor Avery continued. Sarah pointed her life toward everything that was most important to her, and everyone in this room would have to agree her aim was true. A mother to Emma, and a daughter to Vivian, a confidant to her friends, and a guiding light to her students, a true blessing to Cassidy. Jon was grateful for an excuse to stare at Cassidy, capitalizing on the opportunity. Though she was Sarah's identical twin, the years had not been nearly as kind to her. While she didn't look old, she was starting to look weary and jaded. She was still almost as beautiful as her sister, though, with long chestnut hair, green eyes, and Sarah's porcelain flawless skin. Jon felt as if he were looking at Sarah's ghost, and a chill ran through him. Emma buried her face in Cassidy's chest. Cassidy pulled her closer and held her tighter, as if proximity would keep herself from surrendering to tears. Pastor Avery smiled at Cassidy, waited for her to smile back, then continued. Sarah will always be remembered by her students as one of the best teachers they ever had, by her friends as truly loyal and wonderfully funny, and by her family as remarkably strong. It has been a joy to know Sarah from the time she was a tiny child through last Easter when, as an adult, she sat with her hands folded in the pew, just 3 rows behind where the 3 remaining Hughes girls are sitting now. Pastor Avery gestured again toward the Hughes girls. Cassidy managed to keep her torrent inside, but Vivian, never one to shy away from theatrics, erupted into a fountain of tears while Emma bawled between them. Seeing their grief, particularly the young girl's, cut deep into Jon's heart. He sniffed back tears as the pastor went on about how we can't know God's will, but should find comfort that he has welcomed Sarah to the kingdom of heaven. Though Jon would normally roll his eyes at such a thought, he found an odd sense of comfort in the old man's words. Pastor Avery then invited mourners to approach the front of the church one by one to give their farewells. Jon sat silently, heart racing, as Sarah's co-workers, friends, and family spoke of her in loving memory. Hearing their words made Jon sad that he'd missed out on so much of Sarah's life. It also made him wonder who would speak at his funeral. He had few people he could call friends, and the closest thing he'd ever had to love was now in a casket. He wondered if he should step forward to give a few words. Given their history, he feared that to not say anything would be an insult. At the same time, he didn't want this to become about him. If he went up to speak, someone in the audience might shoot video on their iPhone, and it would be on YouTube or TMZ within the hour. That was the last thing Sarah's family needed. The last thing any of the mourning families needed. Jon stayed put, though he wasn't sure if his gesture was kindness or cowardice. When it came right to it, he couldn't bear to go anywhere near the urn holding Sarah's remains. It was all he could do to look at the silver jar from the back of the church, where it was merely a shape. The memorial ended, and Jon did his best to blend in with the herd, which was nearly impossible with the dozens of eyes pretending not to stare. He shuffled behind the mourners, slowly drifting toward the hors d'oeuvres, waiting for the crowd to finish consoling Cassidy, as his heart filled, then broke, with every fleeting glimpse of the small girl trembling by her side. Emma looked lost, waiting for a mother who would never return. Jon ate his cold cucumber sandwich and sipped the cheap coffee, hating his family for not donating something better, and watching the Hughes family from the corner of his eye. Cassidy was bookended between Russ Haskell and Mitch Kilbourne, two jocks he'd gone to school with. Time had been less kind to them, each of them looking at least a decade older than they were, especially with the premature silver flocking the tips of Mitch's bangs and sideburns. Emma ducked from under Cassidy's arm, then slipped away from her aunt and grandmother. She made a beeline for the dessert table and stuffed an assortment of cookies into her purse, starting at the far side of the dessert table and gradually making her way to the right, focusing only on the smaller cookies, apparently going with quantity over quality. Emma looked almost exactly the same as her mother at age 9, another ghost who tore at Jon's heart. She looked so sad and almost angelic in her innocence. He laughed as Emma stuffed cookies into her tiny purple purse and thought of the way he often couldn't help but shove matchbooks, mints, or toothpicks into his own pocket whenever he was leaving a restaurant, whether he'd ever used them or not. Jon wondered where the girl's father was, or if she even knew who her father was. Sarah had gotten pregnant after she broke up with Jon, the result of a fling she had to supposedly get over him. It had been almost 10 years ago when he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. He was on the set of his first movie when he got drunk and slept with a model. It was the first time he'd ever been unfaithful to Sarah, who had, to that point, been the only girl he'd even gone out with. He confessed what he did. At first he thought they'd get past it. She said she'd forgiven him. Then a week later, she called him, while he was back on the set, and said she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't stop thinking of his betrayal. It was over. He tried to make things right, but she refused to take his calls, refused to see him, and even ignored his emails and letters. About 5 weeks after they broke up, Cassidy called Jon and said he was making Sarah miserable and needed to stop calling. And that was that. He went on with his life. And she went on with hers, apparently getting knocked up along the way. An old friend had told him Sarah was pregnant. He'd heard rumors about different men who might be the father, including a waiter, a visitor to the island during tourist season, and even another teacher. Whoever it was didn't stick around and left her high and dry. Jon had considered reaching out to offer help if Sarah needed it, but by then it had been so long, and she seemed to be getting along fine on her own, with help from her sister and mother. He didn't want to cause her any more stress by popping back into her life. Now, as he watched Emma, his heart broke. The child had no mother or father. She was an orphan, all alone in the world, save for a drunk grandma and a pill-popping aunt. When Emma was just a few feet away, Jon couldn't take it any longer. He took one long, final sip of his coffee, set it on the large tray with the rest of the empties, then went to the edge of the dessert table, picked up the largest, fattest cookie he could find, and kneeled next to Emma. "I think you're missing out on these." He held up a slightly larger cookie. They looked just big enough to be truly delicious. The girl looked up at him, then narrowed her eyes as she studied the cookie. She shook her head. "Nope, that one has peanut butter in it. I don't like peanut butter, especially in my cookies." Jon looked at the cookie, noting the telltale ridges of peanut butter rippling across the surface, then back at Emma. I think you're right. I didn't even notice." He wrinkled his nose and shook his head. "I don't like peanut butter either." Still kneeling, Jon gestured toward the table. "Which of these would you suggest?" Emma smiled, tiny but there, then pulled a wee cookie from her little purse and handed it to Jon. Jon took the tiny white cookie, about the size of a quarter and the color of the island's sand under a summer sun, freckled and white. "What is it?" "It's called a Hamilton Island biscuit. Mrs. Rasmussen makes them, but only on New Year's, the first day of summer, and on special occasions. It was Mommy's favorite cookie." Jon smiled and blinked, his eyes getting wet. "Oh, wow. I remember these." He turned the cookie over in his hand. Then, mostly to himself, he added, "How old is Mrs. Rasmussen now? She was like 70 when I was a kid." "I don't know." Emma shook her head. "I asked her one time if she was 100, and she laughed and said no, but she didn't tell me how old she was." Emma looked closer at Jon, as if seeing him for the first time. "Did you live on the island when you were little?" "I did." Emma glanced at her shuffling feet, then back up at Jon. "Did you know my mom?" Jon nodded. "I did." "Do you think I look just like her?" Of course Jon did, but the oddness of the question put a crack in what little voice he had to answer. Yes, you do. That's what everybody says, but I think we look different." Jon said, "That's only because you didn't know her when she was your age." He smiled. "But your mom and I were great friends when we were young, and I do think you look just like her." "Maybe." She made a face, a sideways sort of smile, which sent a chill through Jon. It was the exact same kind of face he made, a face he used to make Sarah laugh. As Jon looked into her eyes, a growing realization crept over him. Yes, she looked a lot like her mother as a child, but she also looked like someone else. Him. He began to pick through the dates in his mind, trying to figure out if he might actually be Emma's father. Had Sarah lied to him? And then another horrible realization. Is that why she broke up with me? Jon felt as if someone had pulled the world out from under him. "What's your name?" The girl looked at him sideways. "Jon." He barely found the word. She reached out to shake his hand, smiling her best despite her sadness. "I'm Emma. It's nice to meet you." He shook her hand, so tiny and frail in his, and felt a growing certainty that his suspicions were right. And then Vivian appeared from nowhere, with her arms suddenly around her granddaughter. She looked at Emma. "We've got to go. Please tell Mr. Conway to have a nice day." Emma's eyes went wide, then she turned to Jon. "Wait, are you the guy in the movies?" He laughed, still kneeling. "Yes." "Oh my God, you knew my mom." Vivian sliced the exchange to nothing, shot Jon a sour look, then led Emma past the dessert table and to the bright light outside. Jon stood boiling, his hands twitching. He turned to leave, then crashed into Cassidy, who was standing behind him. "Sorry about my mom," she said. "You know, old wounds and all." Jon shook his head and held her gaze. I understand. I'm sorry about Sarah, Cassidy. He held his arms open, and Cassidy accepted, allowing him to pull her into an embrace. She cried softly against his chest for a minute, then pulled away. Thanks for coming, she said. I didn't know if you would. He shook his head. I wouldn't have missed it. After an awkward silence, Cassidy said, Thank you. She would have wanted you here. Jon swallowed, trying to work up the courage to ask the question on his mind. Cassidy looked back where her mother and niece had gone. I should probably get going. Okay. He said goodbye with an awkward hug. He felt as if he were hugging a ghost.